So I'm delighted to be talking to Dr. Barbara Oakley today. Barb, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Ollie, it's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Okay, well, maybe we can start by talking a little bit about you, because for the benefit of everybody out there who doesn't know who you are, could you maybe give us the kind of cliff notes of who is Dr. Barbara Oakley?
Well, let's see. When I was a little girl, I grew up speaking a single language. It was English, as you might guess. And for some reason, I was very interested in learning another language. I didn't really have an opportunity to do that. Grew up in a society where everybody spoke English around me. And there was something about learning another language that I thought would get me in touch with reality more deeply. If sort of a different perception of how the world works might help me better understand how the world works. So I couldn't do math and science. I was terrible at them. And so I was intent on learning another language, and there was a way to learn another language and actually get paid for it, and that was to join the Army. So I did that right out of high school, and I learned Russian. I spent about a year and a half at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California. And there, I think what really happened is I began to learn how to learn. The reality is the military's program on language learning is very intense. It's an immersive program. And I learned Russian pretty well. And then later I went out and worked on Soviet trawlers up in the Bering Sea, and that's where I really learned Russian. And if I have a little bit of vodka, it all comes back very nicely. But then I used some of those skills that I'd used to learn language to later turn to see if they could help me in learning math and science. And lo and behold, they could. When I was 26, I started at remedial algebra, and now I'm a professor of engineering. So the bottom line to all of this is that language learning is, I think, one of the most helpful things you can do as a learner.
Before I start to ask you about many of the things you've just mentioned, let's just finish off the story with perhaps the most well-known part of it, which of course is the Learning to Learn course. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that and how that came to be.
Oh, okay. So I teach a course called Learning How to Learn with Terence Sanowski. He's the Francis Crick Professor at the Salk Institute, and it is the world's largest massive open online course. There's nearly 2 million students, registered students now. And what's so funny is I wrote this book called A Mind for Numbers, and don't let the title fool you. It's actually a general book of learning that all about learning that grew out of my language learning and is applicable to language learning. But I thought, people really like to watch videos and learn in other ways than just books, as, for example, podcasts. And so I thought, I should try to do a massive open online course. A MOOC is what it's called. And so I went down to the basement, and at that time, I didn't know that doing something called green screen, which is putting a green cloth up and kind of replacing your background with all sorts of interesting things, was considered a very advanced technology. I just thought, oh, well, that looks cool. I think I'll do that. And so that's the approach I used. And I mean, I remember looking at my husband going, do you think anybody will even watch these videos? And then it became the most popular course, massive open online course of all time, which we never expected. But I think part of it is because it connects the underlying strategies of learning between all sorts of different things, between math and science and music and dance and language learning.
It's I mean, congratulations on the success of the course for a start, and that really is phenomenal in terms of the scale and impact that you've had. I guess what's interesting about that is that the people who come to enroll in this course, by virtue of the fact that they've found the course and they've enrolled, they are interested in learning to learn better. Do you think that curiosity about learning is something that college students also naturally have, or is this something that we develop as an adult?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, here's a little secret. Few of our students are actually college students. The primary demographic is between 25 to 45 years old. And so you might ask, well, why is that? And I think it's for several reasons. I think that sometimes those who are trying to that universities are a little bit skittish about letting people know about MOOCs because they're a bit competitive with them. And so a lot of college students have never heard of a MOOC before. And it's kind of surprising, but that's what it is. But the reality is that I think a lot of college students could greatly benefit from learning how to learn. I mean, it's shocking. Think about it. Most people take from 12 to 16 years of education and never have a single course on how to learn effectively, even though they have courses on virtually everything else.
It's a little like the personal finance point as well, isn't it? We come out of college and we start to live, and the number one thing that governs our lives is money, and yet we never get taught about it. But let's not go down that particular rabbit hole. So, what changes then from the 18-year-old who goes to college to the 30-year-old who suddenly decides that he or she needs to know how to learn better? Can you, from all the work that you've done on your observation of the students, can you point to any particular thing that changes, that brings about this kind of realization of, hey, I need to up my game in this area?
Oh, what a good question. I've never been asked that question before, and it is such an insightful question. I think that when you're in college or you're in high school, everything's presented to you on a platter, and it's kind of like a really full platter. So you've got lots of stuff that keeps you busy right now. You have to take a certain curriculum, and it's being force-fed down your throat, right? Whatever you're majoring in, whether it's psychology or engineering or Spanish or French or what have you, there's certain set courses. And so no one says a word about the fact that, hey, it might be helpful to learn more about the learning process. They just say, here, learn this. And so you don't really have time to step back and say, let's do a meta-analysis and see what might really be helpful for me. But when you get out of college or out of high school and you're suddenly on your own and you're facing the world, the working world yourself, then suddenly you have to, I mean, you're the boss, you're the controller of what's going on in your life. That's right. And suddenly you begin to realize, wait a minute, maybe what people are telling me, maybe I better step back for a minute and see what I think is going to be most helpful. And people at a university are interested only in their topics. If you're a professor, for me as a professor of engineering, I want my students to learn engineering. And I will say that I will bring some insights from learning how to learn into my engineering students' classes, or, into the classes I teach. But most university professors don't have that desire. They don't have the background. They don't have the knowledge about learning. And so they just, it isn't so much that they don't care as they're not aware. And so anyway, students don't know that anything's out there, and they're too busy to really look.
It sounds to me like that's an argument for a kind of mandatory 1 or 2 year gap year before going from high school to college, because once you get, once you have a little bit of that worldliness about you, that life experience, once you've had to make a few decisions for yourself, you would think that you're much better equipped then to take on a task with some appreciation of the wider meaning of that task, or where it's going to lead. Whereas I'd certainly remember going to college when I was 18. I considered taking a gap year. I didn't, and I wish I had, because I just went straight from my A levels, as they're known over here, straight into university. It's like a train. You just get ferried from one thing to the next. And it wasn't until I got to the end of my first year in university, kind of had a bit of a early life crisis and thought, hang on, there's a big world out there. And I actually withdrew myself from university in the first year, got on a one-way train to Paris, and actually spent 6 months living in France. I don't know what was going through my mind. It's the kind of thing you can only do when you're 18, 19. But that gave me, I think, a kind of perspective, or at least the beginning of a perspective on life that gave more meaning to and importance to the things that I was studying. I would, if I were running things, I would make everybody take a couple of years out before they go to college.
I couldn't agree more. I think one of the, it's very well-meaning, but one of the most problematic social programs that we have is the easy availability of college loans that kind of sucks people into going to college sometimes before they're really ready, and before they've gained the maturity and the sort of worldview to think for themselves about what they're studying and what the bigger picture of what they're learning, how that fits in and how it will fit in with their life and their career. A lot of times it's kind of like, well, gee, I'm graduating now and I'm pretty good at this subject. And my teachers tell me I should major in that. And so off they go without really having any context about, what they are learning and where that is taking them. So, I really agree with your ideas.
There's a lot of talk at the moment in the UK especially about university not necessarily being the right path for many, many people, because, there are so many vocational careers for which, a degree, while it's nice to have on paper, doesn't necessarily give you that training that you might need. I'd like to transition to language learning now, and I'd like to do that by putting forward an assumption, or something that I've found myself grappling with over time. And I don't know whether it holds water or not. So I'd like to kind of put it to you and have you react to it, and then use that as the starting point for our discussion about languages. And it's this: that language learning as a topic area is unlike science or scientific subjects, in that it's not so much what you might call knowledge acquisition, or a kind of accumulation of knowledge, or a set of calculations that you can work through to get what could be considered a final correct answer on an exam paper. I've felt that there is that distinction, and I've often wondered whether or not the way that we talk about learning is more applicable to the sciences than the arts. And I'm classifying language learning as more of an art in this case, which I guess is debatable. Could we start with that? And I'd like to have your thoughts on whether or not you think that is a valid assumption, or even worth exploring.
That's an interesting approach. I guess from my perspective, I think that learning in the sciences is far more of an art that is very much related to language learning than many other subjects. It's a challenge is that many educational researchers and psychologists who do research regarding how we learn and so forth often come from backgrounds that are not heavily math-based. So they don't have a good math background. And they will they will devise theories of learning that are applicable for learning if you're learning in psychology or in the social sciences or the humanities, but they aren't really very applicable for learning deeply and well in mathematics and particularly in math-heavy sciences. So what that really means, I think, is that oftentimes educators and researchers who are working in education miss the commonality between what's going on at deep levels neuroscientifically between learning in math, for example, and learning a language. There is both use, in fact, any kind of expertise that you're developing involves the development of a chunk, a neural chunk. And what that is I'll give you a simple example. And that is when you're learning to back up a car, right? So you learn to back up a car, and when you first try to do it, if you just even think about it, it's like, do I look in the front mirror? Do I look in the back mirror? Do I look, where do I look? And it seems like an incredibly complex maneuver. And you think, oh my word, I can never learn to do this. It's very confusing. And then within a few days, you begin to understand that, now wait a minute, all I need to do is sort of begin to, I look here, look there, and you, after a while, you don't even think about it. You can just do it automatically. And learning a language is very much like that. At first, when you look at how do I conjugate this verb, how do I put it in the sentence, how do I know what tense to put it in, and so forth, and it seems incredibly complex. But after a while, when you've practiced, you build these neural chunks, a pattern that you can easily draw into mind for any given situation, and then you find yourself speaking the language. And it's very much like that in math. So you get an equation. At first it's like, I don't even know what this means. It seems so unnatural. What's this X that's, kind of drifting around here, and I'm supposed to stuff something into it? And then you start working with it, and it starts to make sense, and you can pull it up as one neural chunk. So there's an underlying commonality, and I think one of the most important aspects that we know of from neuroscience is this developing of a library of neural patterns, of chunks, whatever the subject that you're trying to learn.
And what are if developing these neural chunks, as you say, is the aim, if that's what we know are kind of responsible for advancing in the subject, do you teach these specific equations themselves as a teacher, or do you teach the students to follow the kind of behaviors that will lead to them developing those chunks?
Oh, good question.
Is that clear as a question?
I think so.
Perhaps I could give an example of this, relating it back to language learning, because you see, when I observe adults coming to learn a language, what invariably happens is that I see it being treated as a jigsaw puzzle, much as if you were understanding a math equation, for example. In that, you would look in your textbook and you'd see, okay, here is how you form the present perfect in English. Here are the rules. Here are the exceptions. And there's a presumption from most learners that if you simply set about learning these rules, and you do a good enough job of memorizing these rules and remembering them, then you will be able to form the present perfect correctly, and so on and so forth with all the different areas of grammar in different languages. But as I see people doing that, and I see them progressing, invariably what happens is they get stuck, because there's simply too much to hold in your brain at one time. You can't remember all the exceptions and all the rules, like the case endings in different languages, whatever it may be. There's too much to hold in this, what seems to me to be the part of your brain that kind of retains information that, I'm probably going to mix my terminology here, but to put it simply, there's too much to hold in your mind at any one point. And I know from experience that the only way to get to the point where you actually use that grammar correctly, naturally, is not through continued study of that grammar, but it's through a set of behaviors which involve time spent with the language, time speaking the language, so you get to actually put into practice what you're doing, even if it's wrong. Time spent noticing, doing as much as you can to actually notice patterns in language that you're looking at. It's only through those kind of behaviors that you are ever going to have a chance of developing any kind of natural ability with these difficult grammar points. And without those behaviors, you're never going to get there, however much you quote unquote study. And so as a teacher, this podcast is completely dedicated to how to learn a language, right? But I spend almost no time talking about here's how you make the present perfect. And I spend all my time thinking about, did you study today? Why not? How much speaking did you do last week? How much listening have you done? Like, focusing on the behaviors that I know are responsible for that progress in the language. And so that's why I asked the question about, as a teacher, what do you teach? Like, do you focus on the nuts and bolts, or do you focus on the broader holistic elements, the behaviors that you know are going to bring about the learning?
When I'm teaching, you kind of have to do a little bit of both when you're teaching in, for example, in engineering. There is some nuts and bolts stuff. So when we get to pretty advanced levels, I mean, you can't, sometimes it's so difficult that you can't just say, well, here's this problem, figure it all out yourself. You have to sort of provide a bit of a template, help people work through a sample problem on their own. So by doing that, it's as you're saying, there's too much of a cognitive load if you have to remember every little detail and every little step. So we provide a bit of a structure that says, now here's a sample problem. And then they start to build a little bit of structure because they work through, and there might be a few steps that they have to come up with themselves as they begin to work through a sample problem. Now, if they're a good student, here's what they do. They'll work through the sample problem. They'll do those few little steps, that they were supposed to fill in. Then they'll work it again, and they'll try to see if they can generate the solution cold from inside. And then if they're able to do that and they start working other problems, seeing if they can generate it cold from inside, and then they'll start going to new problems. That's analogous to you're going out and speaking with other people and you mess up. And you check your solution and see if it works. And that's analogous to getting feedback from people, oh, you made some mistakes when you were speaking. So we're actually doing a lot of the same things when we're learning in math and science as you are when you're learning a language by practicing and speaking with people.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. For the language learning then, you mentioned Russian, and I'm sure everybody's dying to know. Just remind me again that the institution in which you learnt Russian.
Defense Language Institute.
And is that different? Forgive my ignorance on this. Is that different from the Foreign Service Institute?
Yes, it's the military, and I'm not familiar with the Foreign Service Institute, but it's this language institute, I believe, grew out of World War II and having to sort of learn new languages and have people learn them very quickly. But I followed that by having 2 years where I finished my bachelor's degree at the University of Washington in Slavic languages and literature. So I was able to contrast sort of a typical bachelor's degree program with intensive language learning. And then, of course, to contrast that with being stuffed out where you're just speaking it all the time. And
which came first? The Defense Language Institute came first?
Yes. And then the University of Washington, so a bachelor's degree. And then finally just being stuck out sort of in the wild speaking Russian.
Okay, talk to us about the differences in your experience then in terms of the approach, because I'm sure everyone's dying to know, well, how did they teach you in the Defense Language Institute? Like, if you go into a military language training program, you assume it's pretty good. So what do they do, and how effective was it?
I think one of the advantages of what they had at that time, which now is available for everyone, is there was a lot of opportunity to listen and speak. So you had really, a language lab where you could go and just spend a lot of time listening to the language. And I took advantage of that. I really thought that it was important to try to speak with a good accent. And my accent is a little rusty now, but even so, when I say something like "слишком много знать, пора убивать," it still comes out not too badly.
Sounds pretty Russian to me.
Yeah, it's "you know too much, it's time to kill you." So, which I sometimes would hear when I was working out of the trawlers, because they were sure I was a spy,
right.
And I wasn't actually. But with my military background, one could see why they thought that. But so I think some of the differences were that I thought the military had really good set of books that laid everything out very clearly. So each day you had a certain amount of vocabulary you learned. You had drills that you would all work on together. So, so you're practicing kind of, in some sense, chunking.
And this is teacher-led classroom time, is it?
Yes. So we had mostly native speakers of Russian and or else very, very good Americans. And so we'd practice and we'd talk with one another. And it was, I think in some ways it was better than the bachelor's degree, just because the books that we had were so well laid out. And then you had the opportunity to just cram in lots and lots of vocabulary and get practice with it daily with a speaker, which is not really quite available when you're, at a university.
What's interesting as I'm listening to you, you reference the books a number of times, but not the teachers. Is that because, tell me about that.
Oh, good point. I think it's because, and this was where being out working with the Russians made an enormous difference. We had a classroom of about 15 people. So if you have one teacher and 15 people, and a lot of them weren't, they were okay with languages, but they were just kind of, it was the military. They were there. They had to be there. It wasn't like they were in love with it. So that meant that, about for every 15 minutes of talking, you'd get 1 minute of talking, and you'd hear the teacher, but the interactions were mostly with fellow Americans, some of whom weren't really devoted to the language. So I think that's why going out on the ships and working with the Russians directly, where I just had to speak all the time, made a big difference.
But that came a number of years later, didn't it? So for the time that you were in the Defense Language Institute, how would you rate your progress in that time? Are you able to say what proficiency level you got to over that time? Is there a benchmark that they set?
I don't have a way to quantify how good I was. Um, I think what I got was a solid structure. Like, I knew the tenses. I knew how to conjugate things. I knew the endings and so forth. And then, so I took the basic Russian, and then I went on to the intermediate Russian, which was another 6-month class. And I was. It's hard to say how good are you, how good were you.
Yeah.
Certainly, if you just threw me in with Russians, I could do okay, but it wasn't as conversational and easy to come to mind as later after I'd gotten a chance to practice with it.
What I think you're describing, to the best of my knowledge, in there is the audiolingual method. Are you familiar with that that methodology as a name?
No.
It's we covered this in another podcast, but yeah, it's exactly what you're describing. It's a lot of structured repetition and drilling, a lot of work on pronunciation, but very situational. So rather than focusing on conversational fluency, for example, you focus a lot more on here's what you say in this situation, and here are all the lines that you need and the words that you need to get by in in various specific situations, communicatively. Is that how accurate is that?
I wouldn't say that is correct. I mean, we had to do a lot of exercises where we would sit and speak with one another,
Okay.
or speak with the teacher, or do perhaps read an essay and then write our own reactive essay. Maybe about the general subject. For example, some guy jumps out of a plane and his parachute doesn't open and he falls into the snow and he actually lives, but his nose comes off, or something like that. And which is, the kind of stories they had us reading at the time. But it wasn't really like, okay, you go into a bookstore and you say, and this is exactly what you say to order a book or something. It was more conversational and fluent from that perspective.
Right. Okay. Yeah. That sounds great. So from your time there to the 2 years at college, which I guess were spent mostly with academic activities.
Yes. So it was taking some language courses and some literature courses, sometimes in Russian, sometimes in English, but it wasn't nearly as condensed as in fact, it was more like a repetition of things that I'd already learned at the Defense Language Institute. And I have to say, I kind of enjoyed that because it gave me a lot of other time to just go messing around, right. Which is what the college years are for. So.
Yeah, so you've had the time in the Defense Language Institute, then you have the more academic-y stuff in college, and then you go off onto the trawlers, which just sounds insane. What I want to ask you next is something that I struggle with as a teacher, which is that my background with languages, a lot of my early successes with languages happened when I was pretty young. I was 20, 21, 22. I was fortunate enough to have all the right conditions around me. So I was at college. I had plenty of time. I had developed this desire to learn languages. I was lucky enough to live in London with plenty of foreigners around me who I could practice with and rope in to do language exchanges. And had enough spare money lying around to go on the occasional trip to Brazil or to Spain or whatever it may be. And so a lot of when I think about my successful time in language learning, I put it very much down to those circumstances. And so I often struggle to know what to say to somebody who's coming at language learning at a later stage in life, has very different circumstances, limited time, probably limited flexibility in terms of personal life, family life, and stuff like that. I find it a little bit difficult to bridge the gap between what I have to acknowledge was crucial in my language success for me when I was younger, and then the reality of somebody who has not had that and is approaching it from what has to be a kind of classroom-based intellectual pursuit. So when you look back on your experience with Russian, how easy do you find it to extrapolate lessons from that, and in such a way that somebody who has not had that experience and is coming at language learning later in life can understand and appreciate?
Oh, this is it's a bit of a tough question because I'll just okay, I'll mention my secret challenge now is that I'm trying to learn Spanish. So I'm struggling forward, and I'm still at a very beginner level. And the challenge for me is my life is packed, and I know this is true for many people.
Yeah.
But for example, people will tell you that when you have a book coming out, that is a really difficult time. It's a very full time in your life. Well, I had a book coming out at the same time as a MOOC coming out last month, and it's like a double whammy. And for the last, year, I've just been like going nonstop. And those few moments sometimes where I'm like, I don't want to focus right now because I've been focusing so hard. Yeah. And so this has been a challenge, and I think the challenge that I have, even as a language, I've learned a language before, so it's like I'm not being very helpful here, except perhaps in just acknowledging to viewers and listeners that I think many of us struggle with some of these kinds of issues. Just the older you get, the more full your life can be. And so it makes language learning a challenge, which is really all the more difficult because I think language learning is really where it's at as far as just helping you get a grip on life. And even from the perspective of neuroscience, as far as what languages decay, what areas of the brain decay as you get older, it's the language learning areas. And so if you focus on learning a new language as you're getting much older, it can help rejuvenate the very areas that are most prone to decline.
Yeah, I think I agree with you that it's very difficult to be helpful with this particular question because you simply can't get away from the fact that circumstances such as yours when you were young, I guess, and mine as well, are very, very favourable. And how do you replicate that when you're older and you have no free time or very little free time? I mean, when you sit down to learn Spanish these days, even if it's only for 15 minutes or so, I mean, do you think back to your Russian, and do you think to yourself like, okay, what did I do? What worked? Do you try and put your finger on the on what was responsible for your progress at different points, or do you treat this as a new challenge?
Oh, definitely. I reflect back because when I first began to try to study, I found that what I was learning just seemed to slip away. And I thought, I must be getting older, and it's just not sticking because I am, for whatever reason, I'm getting older. And then I began looking at what I was doing, and the thing is, I was just reading it, like my eyes were going on it, and I would write it down, but I wasn't hearing it. And I wasn't saying it aloud. And I don't, that's pretty dumb of me. I'm just busy and I tend to be a little bit quiet when I'm on my own. And I didn't realize that I wasn't actively saying aloud and hearing these things. So then when I switched over to where I could listen to, so what I do is I'll listen to little videos that have snippets. It's something called Yabla, and so I listen to it, and then I get these snippets and so forth, and I kind of practice with them, and I say them, and they stick. I'm just like amazed. It's really quite a different Um, but I think one thing I'm struggling with is just finding the time to, as you say, um, to like get on Skype and speak with a person, because part of it is I always feel really embarrassed. Like, I've only had a few minutes this week to look things over. I'm not going to be any better this week than I was last week, and so it's embarrassing for me to make myself do like an I call with someone and practice the Spanish that way.
It's fascinating, because what you're describing is exactly what I was mentioning earlier in terms of the behaviours that actually lead to success or not. Because that feeling of embarrassment, or it is. You cannot escape that in language learning. I have it all the time now. I've been learning Cantonese for 3 years now, which is a really tough language, and I the shadow that looms over my whole experience learning Cantonese is, damn, when I was 20, 21, I'd learned 2 languages in the time that two languages or 3 languages to fluency in the time that it's taken me to get this far in Cantonese. And I think back to that, and that leaves me with a certain sense of not embarrassment is the wrong word, but it plays on me such that when I get the opportunity to speak Cantonese, it's not like open-hearted, just go for it, no shame sort of thing. I'm questioning myself, and I'm second-guessing myself, and I know for a fact that if I can get rid of that somehow, if I can get rid of that feeling, there are going to be a huge swathe of knock-on effects that will result in increased fluency, increased motivation, and so on and so forth. None of which actually has to do with learning the language itself. It's all psychological and behavioural. And I caught myself on this recently because I'd realised that I'd been through a period of a lot of study. So I spent a few months doing a lot of active listening and reading. And I kind of woke up one day and I thought, hang on a minute, I haven't spoken the language for like 2 or 3 months. So I quickly got on iTalki and I booked a whole series of lessons. And sure enough, first couple of lessons were a little bit getting back into the swing of it. But then after like 4 or 5 hours of talking, I was like, I'm better than I ever had been before. And it's so that it's whatever direction I go with language learning, wherever the conversation goes, for me it always comes back to this. And I've never met anybody who consistently exhibits these behaviours of like proactive studying, time spent speaking, time spent with the language, who doesn't make huge progress. So yeah, that it's very interesting. I wonder, given that, and maybe this is where we'll end the conversation today. If you were to teach a beginner's Russian course now, if you were to walk into a first semester Russian course, knowing what you know about learning and about languages, what do you tell them about the next 3 or 4 years? What do you tell them about what they have to do?
I'm
putting you on the spot here, I know, so feel free to take a bit of time. I guess what I'm trying to get to is what's it really all about? What's it really about?
It's falling in love with the language. I think what you're really telling me here is, like, I want to learn Spanish, and at the same time I think that I'm not letting myself fall in love with the language because I know how much time it will suck away from all my other things. And so maybe if I can just come up with a way to allow myself to fall in love with the language the way I know I want to, but also sort of give myself a sense of trust that it's okay. You will still be able to accomplish your other things. I won't let you fall that much in love with it. That maybe that's the best way to move forward.
How do you fall in love with a language?
Now this is going to sound fun. It's the smell.
Okay. Say some more.
It's Like for me, it was there's a smell about Russian, like this. There was the old Soviet soap, and there was the pelmeni, and the way things that, um, the way things smelled when I was working with the Russians. There's a different, it's just a different smell, and I really liked it. And
I have the same. For me, I mean, Japanese is my favorite language, and it's not my best, but it's my favorite. And for me, I associate Japanese with this. I don't know if you've ever been. I believe you've been to Japan. Am I right? You've spent some time.
Well, I've been there a little bit, but I'm going next month, and I'm like, oh, I want to pick up at least a few phrases,
Okay. Well, when you go, you're walking down a street in some suburb of Japan, and you walk past a little soba shop or a udon shop, basically Japanese noodles, and the smell wafting out of those is, I don't even know what it is. I don't know if it's a combination of the shoyu, there's the soy sauce, or if it's some of the condiments they use, but it's basically the kind of the Japanese stock that is used as a base for everything, whether it's the miso soup or the soba noodles, and it's that is, I mean, why it's that, I don't know, but for me that's Japanese. And every time I even kind of walk past a restaurant in London that is probably nothing like an authentic Japanese place, but that smell hits me, and I'm transported instantly back to Japan. But not only that, I start to get these kind of pangs for the time that I spent there. I was there for 3.5 years, and then straight away Japanese thoughts start to enter my mind, and it just, the smell alone, it brings everything back, and it that sensation, that smell encapsulates everything that that the language means to me. I guess because ultimately it's not just about the language, is it? The language is the vehicle with which you communicate with the people and you get to know the culture. So it's, I guess the thing of falling in love with the language is it's broader than that, isn't it? It's falling in love with the culture. It's falling in love with that way of viewing the world and that way of looking at life. Exactly.
That's what it's all about.
Okay. Well, on that note, let's draw it to a close. I know that you've written a number of books, but there's one of your most recent ones, which I'd love you to tell us about here briefly.
Oh, the book is Mind Shift, and it just came out, and it's about changing your attitude towards what you can learn. So it's exactly the kinds of things that we've been speaking about, and that you've spoken so eloquently about today. So,
who's it for?
So if you're, what's that?
Who's it for?
It is for anyone who feels like they want something broader. They want to learn more broadly than what they think they can learn. So I got to travel all over the world and meet very interesting people who've made some extraordinary changes that give you food for thought about the kinds of things that you might be able to do that you currently think you can't do. So it was a lot of fun working on it, and I got to interview some great scientists and find out more about how our brain changes. And the book's just out, and it's doing really well, so I'm very happy.
Wonderful. Well, hopefully we'll be able to help it do a little bit better. I'm sure there'll be lots of people interested. I'll make sure to leave a link to that in the usual places. People know where that is, in the show notes and descriptions, whatever they are. Barb, finally, if people would like to get in touch with you or stalk you on social media or the internet, where should they do so?
If you go to barbaraoakley.com, you'll see links to my books and also to the online course, Learning How to Learn, and the other online course, which is Mind Shift. And if they sign up for Learning How to Learn, which is free, then they'll get weekly emails from me about all sorts of aspects related to learning, and including links to, for example, your podcast.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. It's been fascinating. I kind of often have the feeling after these chats that we could really have taken any one of the topics that we touched on and spent the whole hour discussing that. So hopefully what we've covered today has been interesting for people and given some food for thought. So thank you once again, and I'd love to invite you back at some point in the future.
It's a deal. And in the meantime, I'm going to go off and smell some salsa.
Okay, for better or for worse. All right, then, thanks so much, Barb.
Okay, bye-bye.
Take care.